Hey there, this is Joe from HomeStudioCorner.com. You already knew that. This is a video all about limiters. With an Understanding Compression series, I thought, it makes sense to do a whole, uh, fairly brief, but a whole video just explaining limiters and what they are, because it is an important part of the process, and they are technically compressors. I like to think of them as compressors on steroids. So these are compressors that take things way too far. They're that guy who always takes the joke a little too far and overdoes things. That's what a limiter does. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Maybe the guy who takes things too far, maybe that's a bad thing. But with limiters are a great tool to have, especially for mastering. But you can use them for other things. But predominantly, I would say 90% of the time, if I'm using a limiter, it's on a master fader. It's on the entire mix during mastering or perhaps during mixdown, but mostly during mastering. So let me show you what it does. Maybe you've heard of limiting and you don't know what it is, or you know what limiters do and you just want to make sure you're using it properly, and maybe there's a few features you're not too sure about. So a limiter and a compressor have very similar features. Essentially, a limiter is kind of like a compressor with its ratio set to infinity to 1. So let me pull up a compressor here real quickly. And I'm in Studio One from PreSonus, if you're wondering. Great piece of software with some great stock plugins that are included. This limiter here is from Waves, but in general, I'm going to show you a couple different limiters. I'll actually drag this limiter over here, and let me pull up a regular compressor. All right, so let's look at that compressor and then also the L1 limiter. So obviously there's not a lot of similarities in what they look like. The limiter is much more simple. We'll even let's leave this limiter up and also pull up the other limiter that comes with Studio One. So what you're looking at on the screen, this is a compressor here, this is a limiter, and this is another limiter. Now the compressor, as you know from understanding compression, has ratio, threshold, knee, input gain, some of them have that, output gain, attack, and release. And those are kind of your main functions, and I think I said ratio already. Well, you'll notice there's no real ratio control on a limiter on either one of these, because they just go all out for it. So let me zoom in here so you can see what's going on. This limiter has a threshold setting, an output ceiling setting, and a release. And then it shows you the gain reduction. This is a little different. It has threshold, ceiling, release, and also an input. And I'll explain that in a second, why that's important. But these are the main differences. A limiter is much more simpler form of compression. So it's like compression on steroids, but it's also simpler, if that makes sense. So I'm going to turn this compressor off. We don't need that. That was just there for let you see it. So let's look at what a limiter does. Well, first of all, the only unique feature to a limiter is the ceiling. So if you look over here, both of these limiters have what's called a ceiling function. And the ceiling is kind of exactly like it sounds. It is a roof. It is a limit to how loud the track can go. So if I adjust this ceiling, and it's just measuring in dB, 0 dB being as loud as things will go. That's 0 dB full scale. If it hits 0, it's clipping, or it's just about to clip. Anything over that is digital clipping. So as we come down, this is telling me how loud the signal can be. So if I don't want the signal to go over 6 dB, I place it right here, and that signal will not get louder than 6 dB. That is the guy standing there saying none shall pass, and you cannot get any louder. And the way it does that, it has a super fast attack and an infinite ratio. So it literally does not let anything come through. So peaks that come through a limiter tend to be just completely chopped off. They don't slowly, like when you adjust the attack on a compressor, it's not slowly letting the peak through or some of the peak through. It's saying, no, you can't get through. And that's how you get waveforms for mastered mixes that look very rectangular, because all the little random peaks, as you can see in this audio right here, there's a bunch of peaks and they're all kind of random volumes. A limiter is going to take those and kind of chop them off and get everything kind of at the same volume, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's the ceiling. So you have the adjustment here and also here. When I'm mastering, I usually try to get this down around maybe -0.6, maybe even -1 dB for mastering. And you'll see that these two are linked. The threshold is just like you'd expect. It's the threshold above which any limiting starts to happen. Now, this is the way I learned to use a limiter, was this L1 here from Waves. So let me show that to you. I'm going to play a piece of audio. Okay. So we've got a mix there. This is a mix of my song called Behold, and this is the unmastered version. And so as you can see, it's fairly quiet. It's not super loud. Now, what we can do is we want it to be as loud as possible. So we're not going to bring the ceiling down. We want it to be this loud, but we want to bring the level up. Now, how do we do that? Well, we could turn up the audio itself. We could use a gain plugin. But on this particular limiter, which is one I've used for years, you pull down the threshold. And this actually does two things. It brings the threshold down to show you where you want limiting to happen, but it also brings up the volume of the track. So it's kind of a built-in gain as well as a threshold. So let me show you how that works. So as I pulled down the threshold, the volume went up, and now we can see that it took the volume from here and added, around 13 dB of gain, and then you saw at some point it started attenuating and doing some gain reduction, and that's that hard limiting that's happening there. The other control you have is release. I would play around with this. Super fast releases sometimes sound a little digital. I think I leave mine around 10 usually. You just listen to it. If it's too long, it holds the limiting for too long. If it's too short, you might hear something. So maybe like 10 milliseconds. I don't really have a science to that. I just move it around till it sounds right. Hey, what do you know? You actually use your ears. Okay, so that's how this limiter works. It's the audio is hitting the threshold here, and the limiter is saying, boop, I'm going to turn you up to this level, and then anything louder than this is going to get attenuated. So let's watch that again just so you get it. I'll turn this down a little bit so you don't hear it quite as loudly. Okay, so it's a quiet mix. Let's pull this down. So now just the snare hits are coming through and getting limited, and everything else has been turned up. So there you go. If we overdo things, it sounds bad. That's the sound of heavy limiting. That has something to do with the release, but that really crackly sound, limiters weren't meant to impart tone, at least not this limiter. It sounds very crackly if you push it too hard. So I try to keep a limiter, no matter what I'm doing, not really doing much more limiting than maybe 3 dB, and especially not going to the point where it's really audible like that. Okay, let's look at this other limiter. It's a little bit different. So you would have imagined, let's just put it the same settings. We're going to set the ceiling, turn it on. We're going to set the ceiling to -0.1. If I can get a super fine adjustment here. That's close enough. And so you would imagine, let's take a listen real quick. Okay, it's still quiet. You would imagine if I turn the threshold down, this is the way I thought it would work the same way. As I turn the threshold down, it turns up the volume. Okay, so it does do that, but it doesn't do it exactly the same way. Well, for one thing, this particular limiter only lets me set the threshold down to -13 dB. Well, what if the mix was a little quieter? Let me go over here and just turn this down some more, which I tend to put out really quiet mixes. Let's say that's the case. You'll see on the meter here, here's 0, here's clipping, and it's probably 3 to 6 dB below that, so it's not even getting it as loud as possible. And I don't want to bring the ceiling down because that's my loudest spot. So that's one of the, when I first used this limiter, I thought, what's wrong? Why is it not working? It just gives you a threshold below of 13 dB essentially to work with. So what I do is I set the threshold on this limiter to the same as the ceiling, and I use the input gain, which gives me 18 dB, and I kind of play between the two. Usually if 18 dB is plenty of gain to get it up to the level that I want. So this is actually an input, so input and release and threshold are kind of two separate deals, and so this is how I'll work this limiter. So you'll see here, now it's nice and loud. Right over here is that it shows me the gain reduction, and this little guy shows me the maximum amount of gain reduction that's happening. So that's showing me around 3 dB of gain reduction. Okay, it was more like 5, so I turned it down a little bit. So now you'll see I needed a little more than 13 dB of gain. So maybe, again, this is just all about the way it was designed. You could use it really either way. Maybe I want to introduce 12 dB of gain at the input and then bring the threshold down a few dB to have some control that way. You could really do any of those. Just know that that's why the input is there, in case the threshold isn't enough to get it up to the level that you want. And the way you know it's loud enough is when you see a little bit of limiting happening here. So honestly, I don't know what just happened there. The threshold is relative to the ceiling, so I tend to just use the input gain, if that makes sense, because I need to talk to PreSonus and see exactly how this works. But it feels like when I turn this down, it's not showing me gain reduction here, but you can hear the limiting happening. Okay, so lesson learned, always use your ears. For whatever reason, I don't know if this is maybe a glitch. PreSonus, are you watching? Call me. But when I do this, you can obviously hear the limiting happening, but for some reason it's not showing up as any gain reduction on the meter. So I'm going to use this limiter in a different way. I'm not going to write off this limiter. It actually sounds really nice. I just am not going to use it in that same way. I'll maybe set the threshold right at the ceiling or maybe a little bit below and just use the input gain. If I need more than 18 dB of gain, I can put just a gain plugin in front of this limiter on the track and be fine. But that is how I use that limiter. So uses for limiters, as I said before, mainly for mastering. So I've got a song that's like this, and I'm not going to get into mastering in depth here, but essentially I'll have a gain plugin of some sort getting the volume up to a certain level. Then I'll have some sort of compression, like a multi-band compressor, EQ in there too, and then limiting. Limiting is the final step. It's the spot where we make sure nothing clips and comes through. And that's essentially how you use a limiter. Other ways that I've used limiters before is to, maybe I've got when I do a podcast, for example, let me show you that real quick. If you don't know this, I do a podcast, at least at the current shooting of this video, I do a podcast with Graham Cochran, and it's called the Simply Recording Podcast over at simplyrecordingpodcast.com. Let me pull it up here, the latest episode. Let's do 11, I believe. And what we do there is we both record our audio. He sends me his audio file, and I put those into a session. So here's my audio, here's Graham's audio, and then here's the music. Now the music has been mastered, so it's at a really high level, but I need the vocals to be loud too. So what I end up doing is I bus the two vocals. I use a channel strip on each one, and I bus those vocals to a vocal bus right here. So the two vocals are feeding into this bus, which has a de-esser on it and also has a limiter. And you see the limiter is set up to just add another 9 dB of gain to prevent clipping. So let's just take a listen real quickly. To the Simply Recording Podcast, I'm Joe Gilder from HomeStudioCorner.com.
And I'm Graham Cochran from therecordingrevolution.com.
So as you can see, we've limited just the vocals because I don't want to put a limiter on my master that's going to kill the sound of the theme music. So you'll see there is a limiter on my master, but this limiter is literally just catching any peaks. It's not doing anything else. It's not adding any gain. So this mastered theme music over here, that's at fully mastered, really loud. I turn it down just a smidge here. It's down by 2 dB, I believe, and nothing's being limited in an extra way at the master. But then I put a limiter on the vocals, just the vocals, so that they get nice and loud. Because if you have mastered music and you're trying to get a vocal to sit on top of that, or coming out of the music into the podcast. Welcome back to the that vocal needs to be nice and loud. And the only really way to do that is you can do some compression, but limiting's the other option. And if I just push these faders up, it might do the trick, but it's probably going to clip out somewhere in a bus somewhere or at the master. So what I do is I bus them here. The levels are fine, and then I just use this limiter to bring up that volume. So that's another practical use of limiting in a non-mastering sort of way. So I hope that made sense for you. I didn't plan to do that as a part of this video, but it just came to me, and I think it makes sense. So those are two uses. I've used limiters on bass guitar before when I really need it to be a very consistent volume. I've used limiters on vocals before. Just try it. You can certainly try it on anything. The goal mainly is it just makes things louder, but you can do all sorts of things with limiting. It's a valuable tool. I wouldn't reach for limiter over compression. I would probably choose compression first, try to do what you're doing. If it's not cutting it for you, maybe limiting is your best friend. Just as with all things, if you overuse a limiter, it's going to be obvious and people are going to know it's going to sound bad. So whatever you do, try to do it in moderation. Try to keep the gain reduction to a minimum. Try not to have any obvious artifacts. And of course, use your ears. We had a prime example of using your ears over here when this little bugger wasn't working quite right. The gain reduction meter told me that nothing was being limited, but I obviously knew there was things limiting because it sounded so bad. So all in all, the theme of my life, use your ears and don't just let the software tell you what's happening. Make sure you listen and that you're happy with what's going on. And that, my friends, is a nice little overview of limiting. And I hope that was helpful for you. Go take what you learned here in this video and go try it. You should have some sort of a limiter in your arsenal, whatever software you're using. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be from Waves, or I guess PreSonus is stock. If you're not using PreSonus, you don't have that. It doesn't have to be what I'm using here, but the concepts do still apply. Go learn your particular plugin, learn its little quirks and nuances, and just try it on a few mixes. And that'll be any time you spend doing that will be a very valuable use of your time, because then you can move forward and use that stuff in any of your future and upcoming mixes. It's all about building on what you know, learning your tools, and getting better at it. So thanks again for buying Understanding Compression, and I hope you enjoy this bonus video on limiters.